we find contradictions between the Gospels. If you start studying the Gospels this way, you begin to realize, it's only in the Gospel of John that Jesus actually calls himself God. And it looks like, Mark doesn't only not record the virgin birth, it sounds like he kind of argues against Jesus being born of a virgin. If you look carefully.
Hello, lovely people. Welcome back to my channel. Welcome if you are new. I can only apologise for how shiny and sweaty I am. This is the first time I've ever recorded an interview or a video or anything with my feet in a bowl of cold water. So today I am very excited to bring you another fantastic conversation that I had with Dr. Bart Ehrman. If you're not familiar, he's an excellent biblical scholar, especially when it comes to the New Testament. He's written countless fantastic books on the subject. I do recommend you look him up, check out his blog. He's a brilliant scholar, but he's also a very, very lovely man, and I always really enjoy talking to him. If you haven't seen them yet, after you've watched this video, if you enjoy it, there are 2 other conversations with Bart on my channel, which you can check out. We're having this discussion around the Gospels because Dr. Ehrman has a new course coming out online, very exciting. It's called The Unknown Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. It's all about how do we study the Gospels and what have scholars uncovered that we've missed? What findings have there been that change our understanding of the Gospels of the life of Jesus? There will be details and links down below, and I will give you some more information after the interview. Please enjoy. Bart, thank you so much for joining me again. So wonderful to see you.
Oh,
you have a new course coming out. Very exciting. I love these. This one is The Unknown Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. And we know here on this channel, definitely that Gospels, very, very important. They tell the life of Jesus Christ, birth to resurrection and beyond. These books are where we get pretty much all of our information on Jesus's words and actions. So it's really important, I think, to know how much of that is likely historical, things that don't quite add up across the Gospels, and so on. So one thing that I think is really interesting, a topic in this course that I'd like to start with, is the topic of how do scholars understand the Gospels differently to lay readers. So in other words, what approach do you take to best understand the Gospels that we can maybe learn from, take some ideas?
Right. Well, there are some ways that scholars proceed that wouldn't be available to most lay people, because scholars have to learn the ancient languages. For example, the Gospels are written in Greek, and you have to understand Greek, and it helps to know Hebrew, because as the Bible Jesus used was Hebrew, and so there are linguistic things that just aren't going to be available. But I think one of the most important discoveries of scholarship goes way back for over 200 years, which is recognizing that these 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are actually 4 different books. Lay people tend to read them as one book. You have a gospel, and you might have Matthew's version and Mark's version, Luke's and John's, but they're basically all the same thing. And it seems that way because they're between 2 covers. And usually when you read a book between 2 covers, you read chapter 1 and chapter 2, they're not they're not contradicting each other. They're just like they might expand or something. And so lay people tend to read them as saying the same thing. And I think probably the most important discovery of modern scholarship is just how radically different each of these 4 is. That you just don't see it when you read a few verses out of Matthew, then a few verses out of John, and you read a little bit of Luke. You just like it all melds in your head. And scholars have insisted, in fact, each one of these is different, and you have to read each one for what it has to say.
That's interesting, because so often when I'm looking up, especially apologetics on the Gospels, I find it pulled together as a collection where like it is 4 chapters, each containing a little different bit of information in the same story instead of 4 separate books. So that definitely changes a viewing. So particularly of interest to me, especially after Did Jesus Exist? And you did a recent debate on the resurrection. We had a good chat about that. How close do we get in the Gospels to eyewitness accounts? As far as I'm aware, none of the Gospel writers were witness to the life of Jesus, but I've heard different interpretations of whether there are any eyewitness or even secondhand eyewitness accounts in the Gospels.
Right. So it's an important question. And traditionally, of course, their names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In the tradition, Mark and Luke are not eyewitnesses. Mark is said to have been a companion or a secretary for the Apostle Peter, and Luke is thought to have been a companion of the Apostle Paul, which is interesting because Paul himself wasn't a disciple either. And so, but Matthew is understood to be the tax collector in the tradition, and John is understood to be Jesus' closest close disciple, John the son of Zebedee. Scholars today, there's not a 100% consensus, but among historical scholars, it's a virtual consensus that these are not written by eyewitnesses. For one thing, these Gospels are all written in Greek originally, and the followers of Jesus were Aramaic-speaking people, and they were lower class peasants. They were fishermen and day workers and farmers and things. They weren't people who would have had an education. Most of the people in the ancient world didn't know how to read or write, and far more could read than could write. So whoever wrote these things were Greek-writing Christians of decades later who were highly educated, highly trained to be able to compose writings, and so they almost certainly were not eyewitnesses. And so the question then is, well, did they have access to eyewitness testimony? It's very good, a very important question, and the question is how do you figure it out? And so a lot of what scholars do is try to figure that kind of thing out. Is it possible they're based on eyewitnesses? And if they were based on eyewitnesses, does that make them accurate necessarily?
So I guess by extension then, is it possible, and this again is something that I've seen as a topic that you're going to cover in more detail, is it possible that Christian authors would have intentionally made up stories? Or was there an intention of transcribing what they believed was real events? Or is it do we just not have access to the information to know?
I'd say it's really hard to know what somebody's intentions are, because even somebody will do things and you're not quite sure why they're doing it. and now we're talking about people 2,000 years ago that we don't know. We know nothing about them. All we have are these books. And so I'd say it's very hard to know about intentions. But what we can say with certainty is that Christians were making up stories about Jesus. Nobody really doubts that, because outside of the New Testament, we have about 40 other Gospels from the early centuries of Christianity. We don't have all of them entire Gospel from beginning to end. We have some that are beginning to end Gospels, but we have fragments and bits and pieces of other Gospels, about 40 of them. And most of them say things about Jesus that nobody on the planet thinks Jesus really said or did. Stories about Jesus as a 5-year-old zapping his playmates when they get on his nerves, or Jesus. There are all these stories, and clearly nobody thinks they're historical, which means somebody made them up. Now, whether they made them up intentionally or whether they were rumors, rumors happen all the time. All sorts of false information gets generated overnight. You don't need 30 years for a rumor to start. It happens overnight. And a lot of times with rumors, nobody even knows how it started. It just starts. And so there's actually scholarship on rumors. And so there's a lot of stuff like that are in the Gospels from antiquity of Jesus. And then the issue is, is it possible that they're in the Gospels of the New Testament? That there are materials that didn't happen or that are exaggerated or just made up. And most historical scholars would say, well, yeah, there are some things like that. And the question is how much? How much like that is there?
Speaking of the non-canonical Gospels then, obviously there's a lot of fun but slightly outlandish tales of Jesus in there. Is there anything that we should be more aware of in the non-canon to help us understand the canonical Gospels?
What I would say is that I'd say several things. One is that once you realize that about all these other Gospels, you realize that there's this kind of genre out there of the Gospel, and that these four are not distinct things that are different from everything else. This was a way of writing about Jesus. So that allows us to put the four at least into some kind of literary context. So they're not just standing out there by themselves someplace. There are other Gospels outside the New Testament that need to be taken seriously for what they might tell us about Jesus himself. I would say there's not too much. outside of the canonical Gospels. There are some sayings in the Gospel of Thomas that might go back to Jesus, and there are some records in the Gospel of Peter, and there are things that might be useful to us. But the more important thing is, I think that when you see these individual Gospels, you get an idea, and you start to understand better how authors put their own theological views and religious perspectives into their writings about Jesus, and they mold their understandings of Jesus in light of their own views. It becomes crystal clear outside the New Testament because nobody's worried about those being inspired or historic. You just read them and you realize, well, that's an interesting perspective. And when you apply that idea that, these are different authors writing to different contexts, saying different things, when you apply that to the fore, then you start seeing some very interesting things. And that's one of the endeavors that scholars engage in.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think even a lot of people that have read the Bible and know the Gospels quite well probably haven't read much of the non-canonical works. So it's interesting to kind of put that into perspective.
Yeah.
So on that kind of scholarly, historic topic, was there ever a point where it was just taken for granted or accepted that these books were historically accurate or entirely historical? I know we have the phrase, the gospel truth, to mean something is totally accurate. Was the gospel ever the gospel truth?
Yeah, I'd say it was almost always the gospel truth from the day they were written. Whoever read the Gospel of Mark, first off, we don't know where it was written. People sometimes think Rome or maybe around the year 70. We don't know. But whoever read that thing almost certainly thought these were things that Jesus said and did. Mm-hmm. Just as 30 years later, whoever read the Gospel of John first, well, these are things Jesus said and did. And they just accepted that. There were some disputes in early Christianity and some recognition that John actually seems to be contradictory of Mark in places, and there's things that don't seem plausible. People did some intellectuals in early Christianity recognize that. But for the vast history of the church, that wasn't an issue. Really until it didn't become an issue of their historical reliability until about the 18th century. When scholars in the Enlightenment started realizing that there could be problems with these books, when they started reading them very, very carefully, not just for understanding their faith, but all for trying to understand them as literary works and as historical pieces of historical evidence for what Jesus said and did. They started recognizing that there were problems here, and that's when they started realizing they may not be historically accurate.
Do we have any idea what, obviously the Enlightenment and people being interested in scholarship, do we have any idea what sort of prompted that change in attitude of being more, delving more historically into the Gospels and the Bible in general?
Yeah, I think it was all part of the move of the Enlightenment. With the Enlightenment, people started realizing that you could use human reason to understand the world and that you didn't need religious dogma. So that if you wanted to understand something about how lightning happens, you don't try to understand in theological terms about what God was doing. You try to understand what kind of climatic conditions lead to lightning. If you want to understand where the world came from, you certainly have the accounts in Genesis, but would science help us understand, just basically studying. And so science is on the rise, and it means that people are realizing that your authority doesn't have to be some kind of divine written text. And once you realize that, then you start thinking, well, we do have this divine written text. Can we study it that way too, to study it historically? And so starting in the mid 18th century onward, people started doing that, and they started realizing that in fact this can be studied this way, and it's not just trashing the faith. Doing it that way, it actually enlightens what these books are about. You start understanding them far better when you understand something about them in their own historical context.
Well, since this is the unwritten Gospels, the unknown Gospels, the unwritten would have a very hard time studying that. The unknown Gospels, can you round off by giving us a little example of something that scholars have found through this studying that we might not be aware of?
Well, yeah, I could. We could spend 3 weeks talking about that.
Can you give us a tiny snippet?
Well, I mean, look, there's all sorts of things. There are archaeological discoveries have shown us things that are very important about what actually was back there and what wasn't. Textual discoveries of manuscripts of the Bible have shown us that passages that people thought were things Jesus said actually weren't even originally in the New Testament. The most famous, for example, is the woman taken in adultery, which was a later scribal addition to the manuscripts of the New Testament. we find contradictions between the Gospels. If you start studying the Gospels this way, you begin to realize, it's only in the Gospel of John that Jesus actually calls himself God. That's interesting. It's the last Gospel. Why don't the earlier Gospels mention that? Seems like it'd be kind of important. And it looks like Mark doesn't only not record the virgin birth. It sounds like he kind of argues against Jesus being born of a virgin, if you look carefully. And so there are big things, rather big things dealing with the virgin birth, the resurrection, what's actually in the Bible. And so that's the kind of thing I'll be talking about in this course is what scholars know. And a lot of the lay readers who, read the Bible for their faith or just out of interest, there's no way they would know this. I mean, it takes people digging around to find this kind of thing out.
And that's what makes this so exciting. So thank you so much, Dr. Ehrman, for joining me once again. It was really wonderful. I love talking to you about this stuff. And I'm very excited for the course. So everybody do check out down below where you can find all the information. I'll leave a pinned comment with lots of lovely information on everything you can get. It's going to be really cool and exciting. Thank you once again. And,
well, thank you. I'm looking forward to the class and hope people can come.
Yeah, I can't wait. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy that and you would like to hear more about the unknown Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, this is an 8-part course. It's the biggest one that Bart has done. You get lifetime access to all the video lectures, you get lesson PDFs, Q&As, extra information. It's really, really cool. I've been through 2 of these now, one on my old favourite Genesis, one which was around a debate Bart did on the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. They're really, really fascinating. If you are interested, first of all, if you sign up before July 27th, you get an early bird discount. And if you use my little link down below, you're also helping me and this channel out, which I would very much appreciate. I genuinely really love these courses. I've bought them for myself every time. I think they're super, super fascinating. It really is fantastic value to get access to Bart's scholarship in a way that, like I say, is so accessible and interesting. Do look up Bart and check out some of his books. I'll leave a link to his blog down below as well, so you can check that out. If you are interested in seeing the other interviews that I've done with Bart, those will be linked down below too. Thank you so, so much for watching. Do check out the link down below for this fantastic course. I would like to give a big thank you and a giant shout out to my giant chickens over on Patreon. Have a very lovely week, and I will see you really soon.